Okay. Here's your third part of all things United Kingdom. You'll notice a new view in the closet. My wife decided, a table in the middle of the closet was not the best thing in the world, that she might be able, need to be able to get clothing or use the actual closet. So we moved, and now I can look out a window and feel like I'm not trapped in a cube. Um, but in this set of notes, we're going to talk about citizen society in the state. We'll talk about how British citizens engage politically. We'll talk about social cleavages. And then I have to go back and add a section. I'll do an additional small lecture on the different political parties in the United Kingdom, because this is one of the project-based elements we used to do, but we can't do that now. We could, but it'll eat away from time for your test prep and things like that. So I'm sure those of you who are worried about learning the new version of the online exam, that will probably be more important than taking 2 days to research political parties. So here we go. In terms of talking about the UK, the first thing that we will look at is social cleavages, because it's different, right? We were able to identify different types of cleavages that existed in both Mexico. Nigeria was far easier because it probably has the most notable and the highest number of coinciding cleavages that exist in their society, but there are some notable cleavages in the United Kingdom that create some division. So the biggest thing that creates divisions is national identity, because you have this, odd combination of four nations in one unified under one crown, which means sometimes people will worry about the issues that are the closest to them, and they will worry about all other issues as kind of a NIMBY problem, right? Like if it's not happening in Scotland, it's not in my backyard, it doesn't matter to me. So when we talk about the breakdown of the people who are tied to one of the four kingdoms, the English by and large outnumber, right? That 77% of the population of the United Kingdom identify as English, 4.5% Welsh, 7.9% Scottish, and 2.7% of the population is Northern Irish. Now, those multinational identities will also compose of, multiple different ethnic groups, and we'll talk about those clusters in a moment, but these have created some of the largest challenges. In a slide or two, we'll talk about the need for devolution. We'll talk about the Scottish independence referendum that happened before the Brexit referendum happened, and how that helped ease some of the concerns, at least between Scotland and the UK for the time being. Where they had some of their most noticeable cleavages up through the mid-90s or late 90s was dealing with religion. That if you remember talking to anyone in your history classes about flare-ups between Catholics and Protestants in the United Kingdom, or if your world history class got to the 90s, I know we barely made it to the Cold War last year. You had a lot of violent uprisings, and it was because some of the Catholics felt persecuted, or the Northern Irish felt persecuted for territorial sovereignty reasons, and they would flag them as religious issues. You can talk historically about religious cleavages. Think of the Protestant Reformation, where you have the creation of the Church of England, where the king forces everybody to convert. Then you have Mary, Queen of the Scots, his daughter, eventually take over and try and erase some of that and bring Catholicism back. And you just have, violence along religious lines more so than than anything else since kind of the union agreement that brings the four countries together. But really, the big issue is territorial sovereignty, right? A question of, these four individual nations, or I guess more so Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, asking the question as to whether or not they need to be British subjects or if they should be free and sovereign individuals. Now, this video is quite a bit old because it focuses on questions that arise focusing on the Scottish independence referendum and how the outcome of that would impact similar movements like, Hong Kong or Taiwan in China, how it could impact something like Catalonia in Spain, other areas that feel like they need to call for territorial sovereignty. So in terms of elements of these social cleavages, really the UK's solution to them has been devolution, right? The goal is to give individual nations a bit more sovereignty back while still keeping the British Parliament as the top of the political food chain. So devolution has increased governance in the three non-England countries because you see the creation of a national parliament in Scotland and an assembly in Wales and Northern Ireland. In Scotland, one of the things that David Cameron promised when he was reelected in 2015 was whether or not that he would grant a Scottish referendum on whether or not they would leave or stay in the United Kingdom. And that solves some issues, but the creation of these parliaments and giving them a lot more regional authority has helped quell some of the issues. Now, the real question is, you have nations like Scotland that voted in the Leave the EU referendum overwhelmingly to stay, and now you see questions as to whether or not they should be allowed to vote to leave the United Kingdom again, since they don't feel like that decision is representative of the best interests of Scotland. Or there are a lot of questions as to how some of the border questions will work in terms of EU versus non-EU member nations when it comes to Ireland versus Northern Ireland. Do they need to create militarized checkpoints and border walls again? Because the last time that happened, it worked out so well and so peacefully. So, it creates more challenges that we're still looking at the implications of, since we are still in the early phases of the Leave package passing the British Parliament and Johnson's government now negotiating with the greater European Parliament in terms of the impacts of whether or not they leave or not. Not whether or not they leave, but how they leave and what penalties they pay. So that really solves some degree of the problems in terms of cleavages along questions of nationality. More recently, you've seen ethnic minorities kind of pop up in terms of a question of social cleavages. About 7.1% of the British population is of non-European origin. So this would be, people from Africa, people from India, people from all over the world, either immigrating to the United Kingdom or their parents or their grandparents or whoever immigrated, and you are seeing, right, immigrant or, non-European families establish their roots as English citizens. So in terms of kind of the breakdown of the largest minority groups, of the minority population, 23% of it is Indian, which is about, hold on, I need to close my window because my neighbor has started to mow his yard at 7:26 at night, and it's probably louder than me. So 23% of the non-European minority population is Indian, which is about 1.8% of the population. 16% is Pakistani, which is about 1.3%. And then your next two largest clusters are Afro-Caribbean, and then, straight up Black from, Africa. You have other elements of the British population that are European, but not English, Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish, because one of the provisions of being a member of the European Union is the issue of open citizenship, right? That instead of having to apply for a work, travel visa or any other paperwork, that if I lived in Spain but wanted to take a job in England, because both of those countries were members of the European Union, I wouldn't have to apply for a visa or things like that if I would, an American taking a job in the United Kingdom. So you're seeing some forms of this in terms of European minorities in comparison of folks who are European versus folks who are, English, Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish. That has popped its head up as well. You've seen an increase in ethnic minority population across the 90s, and then you saw a recent uptick in like 2009, 2010. But mostly you're seeing folks from Eastern Europe were originally migrating to the UK for work or other things like that. In terms of treatment of minorities, there are several um, instances throughout history where we can go, holy crap, it's really, really bad, right? That it was easy to target the ethnic minorities in a very, very lily white country or cluster of countries like the United Kingdom. But we have seen some instances of diminished opportunities or police misconduct or harassment by citizens. It's not as bad as it used to be in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But you still do see some elements of institutional discrimination. But you are also starting to see ethnic minorities kind of break through a racial barrier or some kind of artificially imposed racial glass ceiling, because you're seeing folks of all kinds of descent radically increase their representation in managerial or professional ranks than white male Britons. So it's hit and miss in terms of how oppressed minorities are in the United Kingdom any given decade. Um, so the last kind of group, though, that we can kind of talk about are Pakistani Muslims and refugees in general. Have probably been the groups that face more discrimination than any others in the United Kingdom. And there are kind of three or four good explanations as to why. Well, they're not good explanations. They're explanations as to why they're Islamophobic in the UK. So the first reason why Pakistani Muslims are an easy target for racial and or religious discrimination is the good old tie to Muslims are terrorists, right? That you'll hear that as the justification for Islamophobia, right? That we've seen a spike in Islamic terrorism throughout the early phase of 2000 to 2010. So that's what people use to justify their Islamophobia. So you can look at attacks like 9/11 or the 7/7 bus and subway, like public transit attacks in the UK, where people have kind of looked at all brown folks and been like, uh-oh, there's trouble. The Muslim community in the UK has been the least willing to integrate in some instances in terms of giving up elements like traditional dress, some of the more conservative interpretations of the Quran, and elements like that have made it made them an easier target for British citizens because of the desire to embrace their cultural heritage or elements in several instances to kind of distance themselves. You are also seeing some of that like Pakistani Muslim fear kind of drive itself into the refugee crisis that was kind of plaguing European countries, where you were having people flee wars, religious persecution, sexist persecution, any kind of turmoil that was happening in the Middle East, North Africa, and they would immigrate to Europe. And one of the policies that the European Union set to put into motion was this idea that there were quotas for the number of refugees that you had to accept. So you saw spikes in, overall fear or overall overt forms of racism, because now people were making the assumption that some folks who were there as refugees, and they were there to take jobs and disrupt the British way of life. So we'll take a quick pause and then hit political parties, interest groups, and other elements of public participation in the UK.